Welcome to VN YouTuber channel. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past year, as Russia has increased its troops along the border with Ukraine, more and more people have been concerned about an impending invasion. Some Western leaders have repeatedly warned of this possibility. Moscow says it has no such plan, even though it is yet to withdraw all its troops from the border. Some observers have interpreted the Russian claims as dishonest and even alleged that Russian authorities are preparing a false flag campaign. Simply put, they accuse Russia of preparing to send forces into Ukraine. But in the name of a different force, not in the name of the Russian army. However, there are also observers who have a different view of Russia's moves. In today's program, I would like to introduce to you a brief analysis of Russia's recent actions. A close examination of Russia's geopolitical behavior over the past 2 decades shows that its officials are not necessarily trying to mislead the international community. An all-out war with Ukraine doesn't really fit the way the Kremlin uses its hard power in the geopolitical game. Examples from Georgia, Syria, Libya, and to date Ukraine show that they pursued a cost-effective policy. In each case, the Russian government has a clear understanding of the risks on the ground, and has carefully analyzed the costs and benefits before taking any action. They have established clear and restrictive targets for the use of hard power. The policy of saving costs is a sober choice because the Russian decision-makers know well that they do not have the means to sustain a large-scale war. The Russians clearly had a price to pay before the 2008 Georgia War, in which they intervened on one side of anti-Georgia separatists in southern Ossetia and Abkhazia. At that time, the Russian forces did not really face a formidable opponent, and they could easily defeat the Georgian forces in southern Ossetia in a few days. Russian soldiers at that time actually entered Georgia, rummaged through the city of Gori and stopped. When the limited objective of driving Georgian forces out of southern Ossetia and Abkhazia was achieved, Moscow is ready for European reconciliation. Russian troops could completely cut Georgia in half, gain control of an important oil and gas pipeline from Azerbaijan to Turkey, and cripple Georgia's economy and political system. These can be valuable bargaining chips to force the Georgia government to recognize the independence of the breakaway region. However, the regional and global costs of these advantages will also become higher for Russia, so it has stopped short of a limited military campaign. A similar calculation was made prior to the intervention in Syria to prop up the regime of Bashar al-Assad in 2015. Moscow does not deploy ground forces on the same scale as the United States is in Afghanistan and Iraq. Instead, they limit hard power to fighters, special forces, military advisors, mercenaries, and naval vessels. To reduce risks, Russian diplomats worked with many stakeholders such as the US, Israel, and Turkey in different stages of the war. This operation ensures that the rebels are not supplied with anti-aircraft weapons, and it is a guarantee of the overwhelming air superiority of the Syrian government forces and forces. Extensive Russian bombardment of rebel-held areas provided effective air support to Syrian government forces and allowed them to transition from defense to attack. Within a few months, Damascus, backed by Russian and Iranian forces, was able to retake large swaths of territory, and over the next 3 years, they pushed the rebels out of many strongholds and had a limited presence in northwestern Syria. Russia has achieved its goal of maintaining the existence of the Bashar al-Assad regime at the smallest cost, considering both the financial costs and the number of casualties, even the diplomatic victory over other countries. The West on the international political and diplomatic arena. When invited to get involved in the Libya conflict, Moscow made even smaller commitments and still gained a lot. Russia's intervention is limited to deploying Russian mercenaries and supplying weapons to General Khalifa Haftar, who controls the eastern part of the country. Although Khalifa Haftar's attack on the capital Tripoli ultimately failed, Russia did not find itself on the losing side. In fact, they have held their position as a mediator between the Libya government and Khalifa Haftar and have won a prominent place at the negotiating table along with other stakeholders, including the West and the nation's relevant countries in the Middle East region. When Russia intervened in Ukraine in 2014, following the Maidan Revolution against President Viktor Yanukovych, they took a similar cost-effective approach. They did not launch a full-scale invasion with their weaker neighbor. Instead, they deployed forces without insignia to the Crimean Peninsula, while denying this action. The Crimea Peninsula is an area of military strategic value that Russia wants to secure for its Black Sea Fleet headquarters and to facilitate its operations. Russia made a relatively bloodless takeover of this Ukrainian territory by holding a referendum and presenting the Crimea annexation as satisfying the wishes of the people of the peninsula. After that, Russia did not go any further in invading more Ukrainian territory. An all-out war is not the solution, and the occupation of Kyiv is not the goal. Instead, to punish and subdue the new government in Kyiv, Russia set up special forces in the eastern regions of the country, funding and arming them and a few troops to assist. Russia relies on Russian mercenaries and soldiers without insignia to deny their involvement and interpret events on the ground as a spontaneous uprising. Thus, Moscow gained leverage with Ukraine at minimal cost. Now, 8 years after the conflict began, Russia is amassing a large force of troops along its border. Has anything changed in their approach? This is uncertain, despite Western predictions of an impending invasion. It is worth questioning whether the target of the Russian troop mobilization is Ukraine. Moscow has not lost its leverage against Kyiv in the Donbass region because it is nearly impossible for the Ukrainian military to stop the separatist movement here when it is supported by Russia. If the Kremlin wants to pressure the Ukrainian government, it can simply escalate the conflict in eastern Ukraine, without the need for a large-scale deployment of troops. In fact, just a large military presence along the border is enough to damage Ukraine by severely eroding the Ukrainian economy. Moreover, the Russian authorities see no threat emanating from a democratic Ukraine, as the Maidan Revolution has so far lost its appeal among pro-democracy circles in Russia. Therefore, the concentration of troops along the border between Russia and Ukraine is probably not aimed at Kyiv but the West. Moscow wants to force the Western countries to finally sit down to negotiate on European security, and this strategy seems to be working. Since 1991, this is the first time that the West has seriously talked with Russia about European security. Russian officials clearly understand that Ukraine will not join NATO, as the NATO currently has no enthusiasm for them. What Russia fears is that the US may deploy missiles or missile defense systems on Ukrainian soil. Moscow wants an agreement on many issues, including suspending the deployment of intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe and restricting military exercises in areas near Russia's borders. On December 17, 2021, they issued an outline of their requirements for NATO and America. As long as the Kremlin does not feel that it has received the necessary security guarantees, it will certainly keep military pressure on the Ukrainian border. They could deploy intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Belarus or even escalate in some other flashpoint in neighboring neighbors like Georgia. They could make the war game closer to Western Europe, as they did with naval exercises near Iceland. They can even challenge the US by deploying hypersonic missiles on submarines or placing long-range missiles in Venezuela. However, all these measures will be included in the Russian cost-effectiveness calculations. That means that a large-scale invasion is unlikely to happen. Dear friends, in short, the point of the last presentation is that Russia will not go to war with Ukraine because Russia's goal is not to want Ukraine's land, but what it wants is the playing cards. Both on security issues in Europe with the US and the NATO bloc. Today's program would like to stop here. Thank you for your attention, watching, goodbye and see you again.